Prisoners of war, or POWs, during the 20th century were a part of warfare. Belligerent nations had to develop systems to guard, house, and feed their prisoners, and before the war in 1929, most countries had agreed on how prisoners would be treated in captivity. In reality, conditions for POWs differed dramatically, particularly for captured German soldiers. Those captured by the Soviets faced a far different fate than those captured by the Americans or British. Learn more about German POWs who were held in the United States, what they experienced, and how it shaped the post-war world on this episode of Everything Everywhere Daily. This episode is sponsored by Fiji Water. You've probably heard of Fiji Water and have seen it in stores. Well, Fiji Water really is from the islands of Fiji. Drop by drop, Fiji Water is filtered through volcanic rock, 1,600 miles away from the nearest continent and all its pollution, protected and preserved naturally from external elements. In this process, it collects a unique profile of electrolytes and minerals, resulting in more than double the electrolytes as the other top two premium bottled water brands, giving Fiji Water its smooth taste. Fiji Water's electrolytes are 100% natural, and this water even has a perfectly balanced pH of 7.7. I've recently been trying to reduce my consumption of diet soda, and I found Fiji Water to be a great alternative. Visit your local retailer to pick up some Fiji Water today for your next backyard party, beach day, hike, or even your home office. Fiji Water is Earth's finest water. This episode is sponsored by ExpressVPN. Netflix has more than 18,000 titles globally, but only 7,000 of those are available in the US. You're missing out on literally thousands of great shows unless you use ExpressVPN. ExpressVPN lets you change your online location so you can control where you want Netflix to think you're located. ExpressVPN can also save you money on flights or hotels by allowing you to change your virtual location, as booking sites often display different prices based on the country you appear to be in. ExpressVPN's apps are available on phones, laptops, tablets, and smart TVs, and it also has blazing fast speeds which let you stream in full high definition. I spent over a decade traveling around the world, and I wish I had ExpressVPN during my travels, as it would have made my life a whole lot simpler. So be smart. Stop paying full price for streaming services and only getting access to a fraction of their content. Get your money's worth at expressvpn.com/EED. Don't forget to use the link at expressvpn.com/EED to get an extra 4 months of ExpressVPN for free. There's been a lot of attention given to Allied POWs during World War II. Movies like Stalag 17 and The Great Escape, both of which I highly recommend, told the stories of Allied prisoners who attempted to escape and work their way back to the Allies. While very few prisoners actually accomplished this, it was at least theoretically possible. Once a prisoner was out of the camp, they could possibly make it to Switzerland or Spain. How the Germans treated their prisoners depended on who the prisoners were. Roughly 230,000 American soldiers and about 180,000 British Commonwealth soldiers were taken prisoner by Germany over the course of the war. About 96 to 98% of them survived captivity to the end of the conflict. About 1.8 million French soldiers were captured by the Germans, of whom approximately 1.5 million survived the war for an 84% survival rate. They also tended to be in captivity much longer than the Americans or British soldiers. The Germans took 5.7 million Soviet soldiers prisoner, over twice the number of all other nations combined. Of those, 3.3 million died in captivity, primarily from deliberate starvation, exposure, forced labor, and executions. That's a survival rate of only 45%. So there was a significant difference between how the Germans treated their prisoners. This then brings up the next question: what happened to the Germans whom the Allies captured? Just as the German treatment of POWs depended on who they captured, so too did the treatment of German soldiers depend on who captured them. The Red Army captured about 3 million German soldiers over the course of the conflict. Of these 3 million, roughly 1 million died in captivity due to starvation, disease, forced labor, exposure, and brutal conditions in Soviet camps. The vast majority of these were held for years after the war, with some not being released until 1955. Some Germans had it worse than others. For instance, of the approximately 90,000 Germans captured at Stalingrad, only about 5,000 to 6,000 survived to return home, a survival rate of about 6%. The group of prisoners who had the best treatment, by far in the entire war, were Germans who were captured by the British and Americans. Once the Americans joined the war, they began capturing German soldiers as soon as they entered combat in North Africa. The simplest thing would have been to intern them in Britain, as it was closer. However, the British were already overwhelmed with American soldiers, and adding prison camps would only have put added strain on the country. The decision was made to send German soldiers all the way back to the United States. Not only would escape be useless if you're on a different continent and an ocean away from your country, but the Americans could also put the prisoners to work to help alleviate the manpower shortage that the country faced during the war. Through the course of the war, the United States held about 370,000 German prisoners of war in camps that were spread across the country, from the Deep South to the Midwest and the Great Plains. The U.S. established about 425 main POW camps across the country, with more than 700 smaller branch or satellite camps. In fact, the county where I live in Wisconsin had 2 small prisoner of war camps. The United States not only followed the Geneva Convention, but also went far beyond what was required. To put it bluntly, conditions for German prisoners held in the U.S. were far better than they would have faced if they hadn't been captured and remained in the German army. German POWs in America typically lived in wood barracks, received 3 meals a day, more on that in a bit, had access to libraries, educational programs, and recreational activities. Local community groups would sometimes come to the camps to put on performances for the prisoners. They could write letters home and receive packages via the Red Cross. And the Americans had no incentive to censor any of the letters that they wrote to their families because they wanted them to tell them the conditions that they were living under and how they saw Americans living. In addition to security, the principal reason the Germans were brought to the U.S. was as a source of labor. According to the Geneva Convention, prisoners of war could be made to work so long as they were paid for their labor and the labor wasn't for the enemy war effort. Prisoners were primarily sent to work in farms and factories in smaller communities. They were paid 80 cents a day, which was approximately equivalent to what a private in the U.S. Army would make. Farmers and factories that needed help paid the government 45 cents an hour for their labor. The difference was used to fund the prison program. The prisoners were paid in a special prison scrip, not U.S. dollars. The scrip could be spent at the prison commissary on snacks, cigarettes, playing cards, and other miscellaneous items. The reason why they weren't paid in dollars was that if they escaped, it was feared that they could use the money to survive outside of camp. Many of the more educated prisoners taught classes to other prisoners, teaching them English, mathematics, business, and other subjects. Many of the POWs received the equivalent of a high school and in some cases a university education while they were in the camps. Most of the prisoners worked more slowly and were less productive than typical American workers, but their work was often of a higher quality. Then again, given the work shortage, beggars couldn't be choosers. Officers, again according to the Geneva Convention, were not required to work. The vast majority of German prisoners were not ideological Nazis. However, some of them were. It's estimated that a little under 10% of the prisoners were either committed Nazis or were simply difficult to work with. Many of these troublesome prisoners were transferred to a special facility in Alva, Oklahoma. For the most part, locals who lived near the camps just accepted the prisoners, and in many cases they developed friendships with the prisoners as they worked alongside them. However, this feeling was not universal. Many people complained regularly about the good treatment the prisoners were getting, and there were some who said they should be outright executed given the losses Americans were facing in Europe. Of course, if the Americans had done that, then the same fate would have befallen American POWs in Germany. One of the best examples that shows the conditions in which the German prisoners were held was their daily caloric intake. The German prisoners were on average getting between 3,000 to 3,200 calories per day, which was on a par with American civilians. This amount did decrease near the end of the war due to rationing, however. In comparison, German soldiers on the Eastern Front were subsisting on just 1,800 calories per day. Many German civilians were living on about 2,000 calories per day, depending on where they lived, and in some cases in bombed-out cities, it was much less. Many of the German prisoners actually gained weight while they were prisoners, which was noticed by their families when they returned. The food they were served had to be adjusted to fit their tastes. Sausages, potatoes, and cabbage were popular items. Most Germans refused to eat corn as they considered it swine food. Likewise, they refused to eat turkey or peanut butter. But the real crux of this story isn't the conditions under which the Germans were held prisoner. It was their change in attitudes. Many German POWs arrived expecting to find a country weakened by racial diversity and democratic chaos, precisely what Nazi propaganda had told them. Instead, they discovered something that fundamentally changed their worldview. These men observed American industrial capacity that dwarfed anything that they had seen in Germany. Agricultural abundance, ethnic diversity, and most surprisingly, ordinary Americans who treated them with basic decency despite being enemies. Many POWs were struck by small things that revealed larger truths. They noticed American guards sharing cigarettes with them, local churches inviting them to services, and farmers who employed them treating them as workers rather than subhuman enemies. One frequently cited example involves POWs who were amazed that their American guards carried photographs of their families and talked openly about missing home, humanizing the enemy in ways Nazi ideology had never prepared them for. They noticed that every farmhouse had electricity in every room. Every home had refrigerators, telephones, and radios. Farms had tractors, which were far from ubiquitous in Germany at that time. In fact, because many of the camps were located in the Midwest and Texas, they were often employed by Americans with German ancestry. These people often shared the same names as them: Hoffman, Schultz, and Mueller. Propaganda told them that the Germans who migrated to the United States were losers and traitors. In reality, many of these farmers owned more land than German aristocrats. The access to uncensored information was equally transformative. Many POWs learned of the full extent of the Holocaust and Nazi atrocities through American newspapers and newsreels, information that had been carefully hidden from ordinary German soldiers. Every prison camp had access to the same newspapers as the people who lived near the camps. Only about 2,200 escape attempts were recorded during the entire war, which was far less than 1% of the total number of prisoners. The vast majority of those who did escape were captured within hours. By comparison, it's estimated that the Allied prisoners in Germany had escape attempts that numbered in the tens of thousands. The end result was that their experience in the United States was transformational for thousands of Germans, even though they were prisoners. They were able to see firsthand a functioning, prosperous democracy, which was the antithesis of everything that they had been told by the Nazis. While it was never the explicit intent of the American government, when these 400,000 men returned to Germany between 1946 and 1948, they became inadvertent ambassadors for American values and democratic ideals. They were often young men who would go on to become leaders in their communities after the war. They returned to a devastated Germany that needed rebuilding not just physically, but intellectually and morally. Many former POWs joined the Christian Democratic Union and other democratic-orientated political parties. These POWs had an outsized role in politics, journalism, business, and academia in the new West Germany. Unlike the prisoners who returned from Soviet camps, the Germans who were held in the U.S. were much less radicalized and bitter, and were more open to cooperation and integration with the West. Perhaps the biggest testament to how German POWs were affected by their time in America was the fact that an estimated 5,000 to 10,000 of them immigrated to the United States after the war, often with the families and businesses they worked for while prisoners sponsoring them. Thousands more would later return to visit. And in other cases, prisoners who befriended Americans developed lifelong friendships and correspondences. The generous treatment of German POWs represented American values at their best, but it was also strategically brilliant. By demonstrating that democratic societies could maintain their principles, even towards their enemies, America created a powerful argument for democracy itself. The contrast between American and Soviet treatment of German POWs became a symbol of the differences between democratic and totalitarian systems and became a powerful weapon during the Cold War. The executive producer of Everything Everywhere Daily is Charles Daniel. The associate producers are Austin Oetken and Cameron Kieffer. My big thanks go to everyone who supports the show over on Patreon. Your support helps make this podcast possible. And I also want to remind everyone about the community groups on Facebook and Discord. That's where everything happens that's outside the podcast, and links to those are available in the show notes. As always, if you leave a review on any major podcast app or in the above community groups, you too can have it read on the show.